So here we have a little comedy made by, or at least I thought was made by Todd Phillips. I mean, he had a small role with the movie, but the movie was mostly involved with some other people from Road Trip. And so, Euro Trip is a 2000s comedy that's pretty similar to Road Trip. It's about this teen who tries to save his relationship with a woman from another country, but pretty much has to go on a long trip to Europe to try and find her. It's full of some funny moments. I think the comedy in this movie does come from sort of pretty similar aspects of Road Trip, that being the characters being wacky, all sorts of silly shenanigans they come across. I'm not going to say this movie is too similar to Road Trip because, on its own, it is a pretty fun comedy. It's just overall, in terms of which is funnier, I'd say Road Trip kind of worked better for me, but in terms of still, this movie is still a really fun one. It's a fun little travel road trip comedy with them going all across Europe, seeing silly stuff. We get silly characters. We get an interesting variety of actors. Not many of these actors in this movie are well known. Like, the main stars of this movie aren't really some big ones. We got a few minor actors who we do know, like Matt Damon, of course, makes a cameo, but aside from that, we got some basics, but still, it provides some fun moments. It's a fun road trip comedy that's, got some funny moments, and it's definitely got some reasons to be watched. So here we have an interesting little action crime film from the last decade. Now You See Me is really interesting for me. This is a film involving a bunch of not ventro, some sort of type of magicians, like illusionists, that's the word, illusionists, who are also criminals. They essentially use their fun illusion powers on people to pretty much create a bunch of crimes. It's one of those fun little crime stories with a fun little idea. I've always enjoyed those kind of movies, the kind of movies that have a bunch of main characters as criminals and showing them do crimes in such a unique way of passion, kind of like Ocean's 11. This movie, we sort of see them kind of escape from the police in fun, illusional ways, and we also get a couple of twists here and there. I do like sort of the dynamic we have with these people. We got these people working together. We got them kind of trying to do crime cases on their own time. We get some pretty fun performances from these people. We got stars like Jesse Eisenberg, Mark Ruffalo, Morgan Freeman, even Michael Caine. The good variety. Overall, I really was impressed with how Now You See Me was. I think this really did work well as probably one of the most fun, clever crime stories recently of the past, decade or so. Out of all the crime stories I've seen from the past few decades, this is probably one of the more creative ones, in my opinion. Okay, so remember I said how the first Godfather movie was good, but I wouldn't say it was among one of the greatest movies ever for me. Well, The Godfather Part 2 probably has an even more controversial opinion of mine. It's a good movie. It's a nice follow-up to the first Godfather, where this one we focus on both a little backstory behind Vito, the Godfather of the first movie, the Marlon Brando character. But along with getting a bit of the backstory behind him, the movie also follows another separate story. One where we get to see where Al Pacino's character, who I gotta remember the name of, has to go on living with his family problems after the events of the first movie. The sequel, I feel, while I remember talking about how the first movie was good, but it was a little too inconsistent for me to call it one of my all-time favorites. Well, I feel like the sequel kind of felt even more inconsistent. The movie did tell its story, it did have its great moments, but for the most part, in terms of how well paced it was, I probably wouldn't say it was among one of the best paced movies I've seen. I don't know if maybe I'm just too young to get to the movie's well pacing, despite how off it is for my younger age. But for now, I just feel like The Godfather Part 2 worked well in terms of its story and whatever, but in terms of how it compares to the first movie as well as every other great movie I've seen, I just think it's not to my style entirely. It's still a really good movie, and if you're a movie fan like I am, you definitely deserve to watch these movies. But, not every great movie I have to call a great one of mine. It may be universally loved, but to me personally, it's just fine. It's a good movie. So this is a interesting rom-com with good old Ryan Reynolds. The Proposal. What's this movie about? Well, it's about this annoying boss who has to get away from a scandal, so she pretends that her and one of her employees are proposing. And they play it off in such silly ways, like having to reveal it to family members, having to see how badly it goes, and how they have to pretend like they love each other when really they don't love each other. It's a simple idea that works for an interesting, unique rom-com premise. You know how I am with rom-coms. Some of them are great, others I feel have too much that annoy me with them, whether it's with the characters or how the story plays out. This movie does follow in kind of those same problems, but you know what? I'll give it credit where it's due. It does still work well as an interesting new idea. I do like how many unique ideas there can be with rom-coms, how there's always some sort of incident that they make in these movies with the two, like how a couple meets, how a couple deals with each other, all that good stuff. And this movie kind of works well in terms of how the actual story is. In terms of where they go with it, it does take some bad turns. Like, there are moments where we have to see them try to convince themselves they love each other, but then they do that thing where they get into an incident and they kind of have to hate on each other again and all that good stuff. And the parts where it gets really slow near the end, it's all those rom-com cliches I've noticed. But you know what? It's still fine for what it's worth. It's not among one of the best rom-coms I've seen, definitely not, but it's decent, you know? I'll give it where it is. I mean, I'm always enjoying what kind of movies Ryan Reynolds makes, so I think this movie does deserve a little pass for how creative its idea is and how there are some still good moments here and there. Okay, now here's a bizarre little movie that I can't say too much about. Predestination with Ethan Hawke is a sort of a mix of a time travel movie, a um, sort of interesting kind of film. I don't know. There's not much about it I can explain. Again, like I said, it's probably one of the more bizarre movies I've seen this month. This movie kind of was out there, and I saw it more kind of trying to do a lot of different ideas with itself, whether it's him going back in time, him dealing with sort of people of his own kind, people he has to save, or things that come out of nowhere. It's all that stuff kind of mixed into this sort of forgettable story. It's worthy of watching if you are into the interesting action stories, even the more forgettable ones. If you like watching underrated action movies, movies that action films that aren't talked about as much, kind of fall under obscurity and are forgotten. If you're interested in seeing those movies, then this definitely should be up there because yeah, it was a very obscure choice. I'd never heard of it beforehand, but when I saw it, I was like, okay, what is this about? It's all over the place. It's still fun, you know. It's got a fun premise going forward, and it does work when they do hype it up. But for the most part, I'll just say it's decent enough, and it can be forgettable for reasons. Okay, so what would Heath Ledger be doing before he would go on to portray the greatest portrayal of the Joker? Well, before we got to see Heath Ledger pull off the best Joker ever, he played a bunch of dorky characters, like this one in A Knight's Tale. A Knight's Tale, I thought was supposed to be like a medieval type movie, sort of like a Robin Hood spinoff or something. But instead, what I guess it was a mix of historical movie while also kind of fit into modern times. It's kind of like the 90s Disney films. Let's say movies like Hercules or Hunchback of Notre Dame. Those are obviously set in a very old time, but the way the characters talk and how situations play out feel really modern. Well, that's what this movie is. It's a historic-like type of story, but the characters' interactions, and especially with Heath Ledger's performance, it all feels like it takes place in modern times. Which then again, maybe it does. Maybe I'm just confused with the timeline, but overall, like, it's decent, you know? We do get to see some fun stuff between the characters, and I do like sort of the type of stuff Heath Ledger portrays in this movie, whether it's being the quirky teen guy or the guy who's trying to be as knightly as ever or something. It feels a little too childish for how it's rated, but how it works still is fun to watch, you know? I guess I can enjoy Heath Ledger's performance in his movies, even if he's not playing someone badass or intense or scary like the Joker. He is still portraying a good, well performance. I definitely would like to watch more of his stuff that he's done, since I feel like the Joker is the only psycho character he's ever played in his films. And it sucks that he's not alive anymore, because, man, I can imagine how many other roles he could pull off. Now here is probably one of the greatest sci-fi movies I've seen recently, The Butterfly Effect. When I heard about it, I was like, okay, this is a weird little sci-fi film, let's check it out. Man, this movie was incredible. I gotta say, it's probably not top tier sci-fi compared to other cool sci-fi movies I've seen, but out of all the sci-fi movies I've seen recently, this one was pretty amazing. Its story is about this kid played by Ashton Kutcher who seemed to have suffered these blackouts during his life. Worst of all, he seemed to have done a lot of bad things, so he suffers blackouts during events that he can't see and is saddened to know because they're such tragic events. But when he gets older, he apparently writes all these events in a notebook, and when he looks back at them, he can actually travel back to them, and when he does, he decides to find ways to change them. Only for them, every change he makes to result in a different kind of future, which is called the butterfly effect. That's what the title comes in. It's called the butterfly effect because that's what it's called when you change one little thing and a bunch of crap happens. And throughout this movie, it's just him finding random bad moments that he decides to fix up, only for them to result in different scenarios. And I gotta say, they really pulled off really well. There's a lot of fun with the story, it's a really creative idea. And granted, it's probably not explored as well as it could be, but they do utilize it pretty well with what it is. We get to see sort of how he uses this ability to affect himself, also how it affects other people, like the love of his life, the friends he has, and how every event that he tries to change results in either everyone doing well but him not doing well, or him doing fine but everyone else suffering badly. It's fun, kind of seeing what different aspects there are in this movie, and it really does work well. So even if the story gets a confusing part when I watch it more, it is still overall a really great movie. And honestly, like I said, probably one of the best sci-fi movies I've watched recently. Her. What is Her about? All right, so okay, let me just say one thing real quick. This is a typo. This is actually supposed to say 8 out of 10. I don't know why I didn't look back at it before, but pretend it says 8 out of 10 because I screwed up. It's not a 6, it's an 8 out of 10. It's a great movie. Her is about this guy who doesn't really seem to work well with women, but he does get a hold of a woman online, a AI woman voiced by Scarlett Johansson, who he manages to spend lots of great time with. They share great interactions, they live a great lifestyle, and then of course it gets bad when he has to deal with her in bad situations, and it pretty much has to choose, should he go see other people or should he continue talking to the one woman he can always share conversations with. Her definitely does explore those ways of interacting with AI, and interestingly, I always do like those movies that try to explore the pros and cons that AI can cause, and despite being incredibly unrealistic, still showing them in a cool way so we can wonder if that crazy scenario could actually happen with AI in real life. And I really do like how it's handled. And it does still fall into being a romantic comedy even with the AI woman, but they do work it off well in ways. So even if it's not, incredible in terms of how it works, I feel like they kind of did slow down the excitement during the final half. It did still work fine. And like I said, it's an 8 out of 10. So if you're not, okay, just put it right now, I made a mistake. This is a really great movie. It's not, I didn't get messed up with it too much, so I probably should look back at this, but still, a great movie that definitely explores a fun, interesting new style between romance and AI and sort of what stuff you can get out of it. So please, if you take my rating I put here for granted, remember, it's supposed to say 8 out of 10. Okay, it's not typo error, I'm sorry. Alright, now this isn't a typo. Tiptoes. Tiptoes is like, what is this movie? I'll tell you what it is. It's about a midget played by Gary Oldman. Gary Oldman is playing a midget. I'm not even being politically correct because this movie is not really that politically correct. It's Gary Oldman, a tall guy, playing a little person in a movie where it's pretty much showing, sort of exploring sort of I don't know, diversity between midgets and what women they get, what women don't like him, sort of what he puts up with. It's funny, just seeing Gary Oldman pull off this kind of role is probably a very controversial thing to talk about, but that's just what made it more fun to watch. It's not a good movie, but it's hilarious seeing Gary Oldman try to indicate the midget war. To be fair, he doesn't do it too badly, but still, the fact that he's doing that anyway is just why. It's a basic, stupid romance film that tries to talk about midgets not fitting in or getting bullied or whatever, but they overall don't do it in ways that I can take seriously, because it's either you're too focused on Gary Oldman pulling off this silly role, or you just aren't understanding what you're supposed to take out of this, because it's just trying to, show off diversity between little people, but does it really do it that well? I don't know. I feel like they lag in that. Like, putting aside Gary Oldman's silly reason to do this movie, it overall doesn't really do the best job at showing the diversity between little people and how they fit in. They try to show it off to where we can respect them more, trying to do that thing where it'll give the midgets a light, but it doesn't do it well. And yeah, with how they decided to have Gary Oldman play the main character, it just, why? Alright, so now we're on to the week of Thanksgiving, which I've said millions of times is the week where I look at classics from the 40s, 50s, 30s, all that stuff. So first, here's Paths of Glory, one of the earliest films made by good old Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick made this movie as sort of similar to his first film, Fear and Desire, a war film. The only difference is Paths of Glory explores sort of differently in ways where this time we get to see more towards a Kirk Douglas playing this guy who has to decide between the violence, the controversy, and the decisions he makes during the war he gets stuck between. It's an interesting film that kind of tries to put on a commentary with how wars are handled, how some of the soldiers and veterans have to be treated during these things. And they do kind of try to show it off with this movie. And, while it doesn't really compare well with some of Stanley Kubrick's newer movies, they do still do a fine job with it. It's not as bizarre as Kubrick's newer films, but it does still have sort of the character aspect you would expect from Kubrick to make. Him kind of showing one person's opinions through facial expressions, music, and shots, It does that sometimes. Overall, it would be hard to call this a Kubrick film when comparing it to stuff like The Shining or 2001, but still, it's worth watching if you like war movies and you like seeing what stuff Stanley Kubrick can do with his stuff. Now here is what is considered to be one of the greatest comedies of all time, Some Like It Hot. This is one of those films that kind of shows the cross-dressing comedy idea. This is an idea that a lot of comedies have done. The idea of a comedy actor in a role where he has to dress up as a woman for a certain situation. I think this is one of the earliest examples of that. I could be wrong, but I feel like this is probably one of the earliest and best examples of a cross-dressing comedy. In a movie where two guys who are being wanted by the police have to escape and decide to dress up as women so to fit in with another crowd of women so no one expects them. Then they get hooked up with hot women like Marilyn Monroe, probably the first film I've seen of hers, since she wasn't really alive to do any newer stuff. But still, we got a fun little comedy where these two pretty much have to act like women, have to work off these other women who can be either dumb, annoying, or just too hot to handle, since they can't afford on them because I guess there were no lesbians in this world. Anyway, this movie actually is really great. It's funny in many ways. The comedy is great. The story they set up is really fun. I really do think this is a great comedy. It's not the funniest comedy ever compared to some of the other big comedies I've rated, but in terms of how it holds up for every other comedy we see nowadays, I think this movie really does play a big part. And honestly, I can definitely see why many people consider it one of the best comedies of all time, because, it's got some great writing in it. It's funny, it's creative, and it definitely does show one of the best cross-dressing examples we get to see in these fun movies. So, here's a weird film. It Came from Outer Space is one of those early sci-fi films that kind of tries to explore the idea of aliens coming to our planet. Nowadays, we see it a lot with movies like E.T., Close Encounters, or whatever. But back when it was still an interesting new idea, there's been a lot of tests for it. There's like all these different kind of movies that try to introduce it in a way. Like this film, for example, I feel is trying to make the whole extraterrestrial life idea become popular. And did it succeed? Well, not much from my knowledge, but from what I saw, not as well. it was decent, you know. They did explore some new idea. It didn't feel too much like newer stuff like E.T. It was a new kind of story. It was about this weird creature that only one person seems to notice, and when he tries to convince other people that it's there, they're like, "You're crazy." The movie works fine, I guess. It's not fantastic compared to newer sci-fi extraterrestrial films, but they do try to give it a sort of a spec. And if you like to see some of the early examples of how extraterrestrial movies play out, then this should be fun to watch. Overall, I can't say I liked it as much as many other alien films, but it definitely was trying, I guess. I guess they were trying to make it work out for the whole alien film type of idea, but I feel like newer films, stuff like E.T. or Alien, seem to work it better, you know? This kind of just was one of the early examples of it, and, it's cool to see sort of what stuff we get to see from these early alien movies, and even if not all of it's great, it's still fun to watch regardless. Here we have the master of suspense, good old Alfred Hitchcock, in one of his most acclaimed films, North by Northwest, the story of a man who pretty much has to face with situations such as him being accused of something, him having to run away from the people who are after him, and it's all sorts of crazy stuff in this movie. I guess with all the ideas of him being wanted or being chased after, it can be hard to follow sometimes. Granted, I was a little disappointed that I didn't love this as much as some of his other great movies, but it was still pretty good. I think this movie does still work really well with, giving our main character a lot of crazy stuff to work off of. Whether it's him becoming a victim or him kind of having to work off of the people who are against him. I do kind of like the stuff we get. The movie does have sort of a comedic aspect in it, and that there are a lot of moments that feel really funny for its sake. This isn't a comedy, mind you. It's supposed to be one of his serious suspense films, but we do get a lot of comedic little bits with this movie, whether it's from Cary Grant or the people he interacts with. And granted, I feel it was a little too much for what was supposed to be a serious story. It still worked fine, It was still a really good film that did explore this kind of stuff well, and maybe I'm just not understanding enough of it, but I think North by Northwest has an interesting thing going for it, and I feel like even though there's a lot more creativity I could have seen here, there is still enough to make it work well, and I can definitely see why other people call it one of the best films of his. It's not one of my favorites, but it's really good for what it's worth, which I guess just proves how great Alfred Hitchcock can be. And now, finishing off the month, we have a View Askew-universe movie, Dogma, probably one of the more obscure movies of this franchise. Dogma, starring Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, along with a couple of other actors from this franchise, like good old Jay and Silent Bob, of course. This is a weird movie about angels who are stuck on Earth, and before they get back to Earth, a bunch of other people are trying to stop them because they're too dangerous to go back to heaven. It's a weird idea. It's supposed to be like a religious type of movie, one where we get sort of this religious commentary along with a bunch of satirical bits of making fun of Jesus and Satan and all that. Like, we got these two who pretty much are supposed to be angels, but also kind of, I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain it when you look at it more, but I feel like the best way to explain it is how I explain the story. It really is just two angels who are trying to be stopped from getting back to Earth by everyone around them. We get some funny... I think the best way to look at this movie is from the comedy. Because, there's good comedy, whether it's between these two having to be portrayed as badass angels, or then there's Jay and Silent Bob who provide their fun blend of comedy, or even good old Alan Rickman, who can be a lot of fun in this movie. So yeah, it's a lot of stuff to work off of. If maybe you would understand religion in this movie better, it would work, but for a movie that kind of tries to be satirical as well as all other things for its story, I think there's pretty much a good reason why Dogma is probably the most obscure one out of all these movies, or maybe that's just the most obscure one I've seen out of them. I still gotta finish off this franchise. I'm going out of order, so I'll just, try to connect it as well as I can, even though I feel like there's not a lot in this movie to connect other than it's angels and demons and devils and all that crap. Have I described it wrong? Well, that's just what I do.